You can't make yourself care about anything anymore. The drive that once propelled you through life has completely vanished. Goals that used to excite you feel pointless. Activities that brought joy now feel empty. Carl Jung knew exactly why this happens. Spiritual awakening doesn't just expand consciousness, it demolishes the entire psychological machinery that created motivation in the first place. He called it the death of the provisional life, and understanding it is the only way through this terrifying emptiness. Today I'm revealing Jung's 5 explanations for why spiritual awakening destroys motivation, and more importantly, why this destruction is necessary for what he called authentic action to emerge. Because the motivation you've lost was never real. It was a sophisticated illusion that had to die. Here's what Jung discovered. What we call motivation is actually unconscious compulsion dressed up as conscious choice. It runs on fear, comparison, and the desperate need to escape inner emptiness. When awakening reveals these mechanisms, the entire motivational system collapses. You're not broken. You're free from a prison you didn't know you were in. But that freedom feels like death until something new emerges. Let's start with why everything suddenly feels meaningless. The collapse of the false purpose structure. Jung discovered that before awakening, your entire life was organized around what he called substitute purposes, external goals that mask the real psychological needs they were meant to fulfill. That career wasn't about contribution. It was about proving worth. That relationship wasn't about love. It was about avoiding aloneness. That achievement wasn't about excellence. It was about earning acceptance. Awakening reveals these substitutions, and suddenly every goal feels empty because you see what it really represents. Here's what this means practically. For years, perhaps decades, you've been pursuing things that seemed meaningful but were actually psychological band-aids. The promotion you worked toward wasn't really about professional growth. It was about healing childhood feelings of inadequacy. The fitness goals weren't about health. They were about controlling mortality anxiety. The creative projects weren't about expression. They were about seeking validation. Jung wrote, "When consciousness expands, it reveals the unconscious motivations behind conscious goals. The person discovers they've been pursuing symbols rather than substance, and the symbols lose their power to motivate." This revelation manifests in a complete motivational collapse Jung documented extensively. Projects you were passionate about suddenly seem pointless. You can see exactly what psychological wound each goal was trying to heal, and seeing it makes the goal lose all power. It's like discovering that the treasure map you've been following leads nowhere. The motivation to continue evaporates instantly. What makes this so disorienting is that these substitute purposes gave your life structure and meaning. They organized your days, defined your identity, and provided direction. Without them, you're left in what Jung called purposeless presence, alive, but without any reason to move in any particular direction. Every option seems equally meaningless because you can see through the psychological game each one represents. Jung identified specific substitute purposes that commonly collapse. Success as substitute for love. When you realize no amount of achievement will make you feel loved, the drive for success dies. Relationships as substitute for self-acceptance. When you see you've been seeking yourself in others, the desperate need for connection transforms. Knowledge as substitute for security. When you understand that no amount of information can protect you from uncertainty, the compulsive learning stops. The collapse extends to spiritual goals too. Jung observed that people often transfer their substitute purposes to spiritual achievements. Enlightenment becomes the new success. Consciousness becomes the new status. Awakening becomes the new identity. But true awakening reveals these as more substitutes, causing even spiritual motivation to collapse. This isn't depression, though it can feel similar. Jung distinguished between clinical depression and what he called purposive emptiness, the necessary void that appears when false purposes die, but true purpose hasn't yet emerged. Depression is stagnant. This emptiness is pregnant with possibility. Depression closes down. This opens up. Depression says nothing matters. This says false things no longer matter. The key insight Jung offered is that this collapse is necessary. You can't discover authentic purpose while pursuing substitute purposes. The false must die for the true to be born. The motivation you've lost was never yours. It was programmed by family, culture, and unconscious complexes. Its death is not loss, but liberation. But understanding the collapse doesn't immediately restore motivation. There's another reason for the emptiness: the end of time-bound consciousness. Jung's second insight reveals something profound. Motivation depends on what he called temporal tension, the psychological gap between present and future that creates the desire to move towards something. But spiritual awakening often brings you into what Jung termed the eternal now, where past and future lose their psychological reality. Without temporal tension, there's literally nothing to move toward, no future to create, no goal to achieve. Here's what happens. Before awakening, you lived in psychological time, constantly comparing present to past, projecting into future, living in the tension between what is and what could be. This temporal tension created natural motivation. The future held promises. Goals existed in tomorrow. Better was always ahead. This forward-pulling force organized all action. Jung wrote, "The awakened consciousness often loses the illusion of linear time, and with it, the motivation that depends on temporal becoming. When you realize there is only now, the entire structure of goal-oriented action collapses." This temporal shift manifests in specific ways Jung documented. Planning becomes impossible because the future feels unreal. You can't imagine tomorrow with enough reality to motivate today's action. Goals lose meaning because they exist in a future that doesn't psychologically exist. Even simple tasks feel pointless because they're oriented toward a tomorrow that has no emotional reality. What makes this particularly challenging is that society operates entirely on temporal consciousness. Careers are built on 5-year plans. Relationships are maintained through future commitments. Economics runs on delayed gratification. When you lose temporal tension, you become unable to participate in these time-based structures, but you still have to survive within them. Jung observed that awakened individuals often experience what he called temporal vertigo, dizziness from losing the reference points of past and future. Without these references, there's no sense of progress, no feeling of movement, no experience of development. You're always here, always now, and here and now doesn't seem to go anywhere. The eternal now also eliminates what Jung called the hope mechanism, the belief that future will be better than present. This hope, however illusory, drives enormous amounts of human behavior. When awakening reveals that there is only now, hope becomes meaningless. Not in a depressing way, but in a factual way. There's nowhere else for better to exist except now. This creates practical problems Jung identified. How do you maintain a job when career progression feels meaningless? How do you save money when the future doesn't feel real? How do you maintain relationships when promises about tomorrow carry no weight? The entire structure of normal life depends on temporal consciousness you no longer have. Jung's insight was that this isn't a problem to solve, but a transition to navigate. The old temporal motivation must die for what he called present-centered action to emerge. Action that comes from the fullness of now, rather than the emptiness of not yet. Yet, even understanding temporal collapse doesn't explain all motivational loss. The death of the comparing mind. Jung discovered that most motivation comes from what he called comparative drive, the constant psychological comparison to others that creates the need to achieve, improve, and succeed. But awakening reveals comparison as illusion. When you truly see that each person is incomparably unique, living their own archetypal pattern, the entire basis for comparison dissolves, and with it, most of what created motivation. Here's what Jung understood. Before awakening, you knew your value only through comparison. Better than some, worse than others, constantly measuring, adjusting, competing. This comparative process created endless motivation. Someone was always ahead to catch up to, someone always behind to stay ahead of. The race never ended because there were always other runners. Jung wrote, "The comparing mind is the ego's primary tool for maintaining motivation through perpetual dissatisfaction. When awakening reveals the impossibility of true comparison, this motivational mechanism ceases to function." The death of comparison manifests in profound ways Jung documented. Success becomes meaningless when you can't compare it to failure. Achievement feels empty when there's no one to surpass. Progress seems pointless when you realize everyone's on completely different journeys. The entire competitive structure that organized your efforts simply stops making sense. What's particularly disorienting is that comparison was so fundamental, you didn't realize how much it drove you. That workout routine was motivated by comparison to others' bodies. That career ambition was fueled by comparison to peers' success. That spiritual practice was driven by comparison to others' development. Remove comparison, and these activities lose their emotional charge. Jung identified what he called the uniqueness realization, the awakened understanding that each person is living out their own unique psychological and spiritual pattern. You can't compare a rose to an oak, a mountain to an ocean. When you see each person as an utterly unique expression of consciousness, comparison becomes not just meaningless, but impossible. This extends to self-comparison too. Jung observed that people lose motivation from comparing to their own past or potential future, but awakening reveals that you're not the same person from moment to moment. The you of yesterday is gone. The you of tomorrow doesn't exist. There's no fixed self to compare to, no stable identity to improve. The social implications are profound. Jung noted that most social bonding happens through shared comparison, discussing who's doing better or worse, sharing competitive anxieties, bonding over mutual measurement. When you can no longer genuinely engage in comparison, many social connections lose their basis. Jung emphasized that the death of comparison isn't loss, but liberation. The endless race that never could be won is over. The constant measurement that never brought satisfaction ends. The perpetual competition that exhausted your life force stops. But this liberation initially feels like emptiness because comparison was so central to motivation. as challenging as losing comparison is, there's an even deeper reason for motivational death. If you're experiencing these reasons, collapsed purposes, ended temporal tension, dead comparison, you're not falling apart. You're transitioning from false motivation to what Jung called action from being. The emptiness is necessary. Before we explore the final 2 reasons for your motivational death, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Comment below which aspect of lost motivation feels most challenging. Your honesty helps others recognize their own experience. Now, these last 2 reasons reveal why Jung believed this motivational death was preparing something extraordinary. The revelation of choice as illusion. Jung discovered one of the most disturbing causes of motivational loss. Awakening often reveals that what you thought were your choices were actually unconscious patterns playing out automatically. Free will, personal decision, individual choice. Jung found these were mostly illusions covering unconscious compulsions. When you see that you haven't been choosing, but have been being chosen by forces beyond conscious control, motivation collapses because the very idea of personal will is revealed as fantasy. Here's what Jung observed. Before awakening, you believed you were the author of your actions. You chose your career, selected your partners, decided your interests. This sense of personal agency created motivation. You were the director of your life's movie. But awakening reveals what Jung called the impersonal forces, archetypes, complexes, inherited patterns, and collective unconscious material that actually drive most behavior. Jung wrote, "The individual discovers they are not the player, but the played, not the dreamer, but the dreamed." This revelation of personal powerlessness paradoxically precedes the emergence of true power. This revelation manifests in shocking recognitions Jung documented. You realize you chose partners who perfectly matched your unconscious complexes, thinking you were choosing freely. You pursued careers that fulfilled inherited family patterns, believing they were personal decisions. You developed interests that served archetypal forces, imagining they were individual preferences. What makes this so devastating is that it retroactively reframes your entire life. Every choice you thought you made freely is revealed as unconscious pattern. Every decision you took pride in shows itself as automatic programming. Every path you thought you selected was actually selected for you by forces you weren't conscious of. Jung identified what he called the puppet revelation, seeing that you've been moved by invisible strings your whole life. Family complexes pulled one string, cultural conditioning another, archetypal patterns yet another. What felt like dancing was really being danced. What seemed like willing was really being willed. This extends to present moment experience. Jung observed that awakened individuals often watch themselves acting without feeling they're choosing the actions. Words emerge without conscious selection. Decisions happen without deliberation. Actions occur without personal will initiating them. It's what Jung called witnessing the automatic self, observing the machine of personality operate independently. The implications for motivation are severe. If you're not really choosing, why try? If actions happen automatically, why make effort? If everything is unconscious pattern, why attempt conscious change? The entire framework of personal will that supported motivation dissolves. Jung's insight was that this revelation is necessary for what he called true will to emerge. Will that comes not from ego, but from self, not from person, but from totality. But between the death of ego, will and birth of self, will lies a desert of non-doing that can last years. Yet even this revelation doesn't complete the picture. The recognition that nothing needs doing. Jung's final explanation for lost motivation is perhaps the most radical. Awakening brings what he called the perfection recognition, the direct perception that reality is already complete, already perfect, already whole, exactly as it is. Nothing needs fixing, improving, or changing. This isn't a belief or philosophy, but a direct perception that eliminates the fundamental basis for all motivated action, the idea that something needs to be different. Here's what Jung discovered. All motivation stems from a sense of incompletion, the feeling that something's missing, wrong, or needing improvement. This creates what Jung called the improvement impulse, the constant drive to make things better, fix problems, achieve goals. But when awakening reveals reality's fundamental completeness, this improvement impulse simply dissolves. There's nothing to fix because nothing's broken. Jung wrote, "The awakened consciousness perceives what mystics have always known. That existence is already perfect in its apparent imperfection." This perception eliminates the psychological basis for motivated action. This recognition manifests in profound shifts Jung documented. Problems stop appearing as problems. They are simply patterns unfolding perfectly. Suffering doesn't require fixing. It's playing its role flawlessly. Imperfection doesn't need perfecting. It's the perfect expression of imperfection. The entire framework of problem solution that drives human action stops making sense. What makes this so challenging is that it appears to eliminate the basis for all action. If nothing needs doing, why do anything? If everything's perfect, why move? If nothing needs changing, why change? The logical mind can't reconcile perfection with action, completeness with movement. Jung observed that this recognition often leads to what he called enlightened paralysis, being so aware of perfection that you can't participate in the world's improvement projects. Others are desperately trying to fix things, and you see nothing needing repair. Others are urgently pursuing goals, and you see nowhere that needs reaching. This extends to personal development too. Jung noted that awakening reveals even the spiritual journey as unnecessary. You're already what you're seeking. You've always been whole. The entire project of self-improvement, even spiritual development, is revealed as a game consciousness plays with itself. The social implications are profound. Jung identified that most human bonding happens through shared problems and mutual improvement projects. When you no longer see problems or feel the improvement impulse, these bonds weaken. You can't genuinely share others' urgency about fixing things you see as already perfect. Jung's crucial insight was that this recognition doesn't lead to permanent inaction, but to what he called unmotivated action. Action that arises not from need, but from abundance. Not from problem, but from play. Not from incompletion, but from overflow. Like a tree growing, not because it should, but because that's what trees do. Here's Jung's complete picture of why you've lost motivation after awakening. False purposes have collapsed. Temporal tension has ended. Comparison has died, choice is revealed as illusion, and nothing appears to need doing. Together, these create what Jung called the motivational void, a necessary emptiness between the death of false motivation and the birth of authentic action. Jung wrote, "The loss of motivation after awakening is not pathology but transition. The old engines of action must fail completely before new ones can emerge." What Jung understood that many miss. This void period is not passive, but deeply active at unconscious levels. While the conscious mind experiences emptiness and inability to act, the unconscious is reorganizing completely. New patterns of action are forming. Different sources of movement are developing. What Jung called self-directed will is gradually replacing ego-directed will. The practical implications are challenging. Jung acknowledged that bills still need paying, relationships still need tending, bodies still need caring for, all while feeling absolutely no motivation to do any of it. He called this the practical paradox of awakening, having to function in a motivation-based world without motivation. Jung's advice was radical. Stop trying to restore motivation. Instead, he suggested what he called minimal doing, taking only actions that absolutely must be taken, and watching to see what emerges from the emptiness. This isn't laziness, but what Jung termed active waiting, holding space for new forms of action to emerge. What eventually emerges, Jung discovered, is action without motivation. Doing that doesn't come from lack, but from fullness, movement that doesn't seek result, but expresses nature, work that doesn't pursue goals, but manifests essence. This new form of action can take years to develop, and the waiting is excruciating for the ego that defines itself through doing. If you've lost all motivation after awakening, if you can't make yourself care, can't force yourself to act, can't find reasons to move, you're not broken. You're in what Jung called the sacred paralysis, the necessary pause between deaths and births. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to join others navigating this impossible transition. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.